Hi, I am Caroline Bristow. I'm the director of the Cambridge School Classics Project, a project in the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. And I'm going to be speaking to you about breaking silence through classical myths and stories. As you will have gleaned from the abstract, this talk does touch on issues of rape and sexual violence, both in myth and literature, but also in society and reality. And just to explain my own position in relation to this material, I was a teacher for a good part of my career, with a particular interest in safeguarding and pastoral work. I am now an educationalist, for want of a better word. I work in theory of education and looking at how we resource and support teachers. But I am also a survivor of sexual violence. And so a lot of my work on this comes both from the professional standpoint as to the teacher who has been handling this material, but also as the survivor of violence who has encountered the ways that other people handle this material and the impact that has. In this passage on the screen, Sorkin Rabinowitz gets to the heart of the matter by distinguishing between managing difficult conversations and teaching difficult subjects. Amanda Conradi, although speaking about her experiences as a teacher of sociology, also offers a similar insight when she says, "It is not that some students bring their private troubles into the classroom. Rather, teachers bring into the classroom some topics that resonate with their students' lives. This resonance should not be feared, but acknowledged. Those who have had violence perpetrated against them should be accepted, not elided or minimised. In both our classrooms and society in general, there is still too much silence around the issue." Homer's words regarding Persephone's desperate cries could have been written yesterday. Despite 3,000 years distance, they remain heavy with resonance, as demonstrated by their similarity to the title of this NSPCC report, linked at the bottom of the slide, into issues surrounding childhood experiences of sexual violence and their disclosure. I very much doubt the person who wrote this report was familiar with the Homeric hymn to Demeter. However, they would have been painfully familiar with the problems faced by many children and young people against whom sexual violence has been committed. Many survivors delay their disclosures for a significant period of time, possibly decades, in fact, often decades, correlating with how young they were when the abuse began. And some children and adults later will never talk about it at all. This can be due to many things, but there are two kind of main categories. Developmental factors, which influence the ability to disclose. Children or young people may not recognise what was happening to them as abuse or even wrong. They also might know something's not right, but they lack the language and vocabulary to vocalise or investigate what they've been experiencing. The other issue, of course, is shame, guilt or embarrassment, which are also incredibly frequent barriers to disclosure, particularly among young men. In these descriptions taken from the NSPCC report mentioned above, we can see the impact of these developmental issues. The individuals here describe their lack of understanding as children, their sense that what was happening was somehow normal and that a disclosure would be dismissed as just something that happens and something you're expected to handle. Education is crucial in breaking this cycle of abuse and the culture of silence around it. If we do not speak openly with children about healthy and safe views of sex, consent, bodily autonomy, then we risk the person who explains these ideas being an abuser, who means that child harm. Key areas identified by the NSPCC report include those which enable children to identify abuse and violence and which give language to enable them to describe what has happened. The quotes on the slides are from that report and its recommendations. Having very briefly explained why it's important to create space for conversations about bodies, sex and consent with children and young people, I want to spend a couple of minutes discussing why I feel myth is such a potentially useful tool for tackling this. The links on this page are to a talk by Jonathan Gottschall about his work on humans as the storytelling animal, and a frankly brilliant summary of his work by Jag Bala, which is written for the Scientific American. These are really handy links for those who might be really interested in this, but don't fancy reading Gottschall's entire book. Gottschall suggests that human nature is to tell stories, not purely for entertainment, but as a method by which we make sense of the world around us. Stories are used to transmit norms and values, to experiment with people physics, I love that term, if you will, by working in what I refer to personally as the story space. We do not have to pay full price for the feelings which arise when working in that space. Distance and therefore relative safety is created. As has been widely discussed, this is one of the very reasons for the existence of myth. I'm not going to go into this too much, I only have 20 minutes. But issues of sexual violence, women's autonomy, and the power dynamics of society arise so often in myth, precisely because these are issues and areas which are complex and messy, for want of a better word. The myths of the ancient Greeks gave people a way to explore and react to extreme visions of reality, enabling them to perhaps begin to wrestle with the more mundane manifestations in their day-to-day lives. I once heard Edith Hall speaking about Greek tragedy in a lecture preceding a performance of Medea at the National Theatre. She commented that what makes Medea compelling is the way she forces us to confront something dark and uncomfortable about the relationship between a parent and their child. The vulnerability of the child and the fallibility of the parent who is capable of doing harm while still loving. She commented that embracing and exploring these darker, complex areas of the human condition in theatre and literature, my story space, if you will, may have led to a far healthier relationship with these elements than we have today in a society which is incredibly squeamish about them. I have to say, I completely agree with her. In the 1970s, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two Israeli psychologists, wrote some of the most groundbreaking papers to shape psychology, economics, and social science. They essentially trolled their entire discipline, for which I applaud them. They proved that humans do not think like statisticians, even when they are, in fact, statisticians. Instead, we judge things against the stories in our heads, the heuristics. We can be persuaded by a likely narrative and will reject ones we perceive as unlikely, even if confronted with evidence to the contrary. This is actually a very useful evolutionary skill. Sometimes we need to think fast and rely on snap decisions shaped by our internal narrative. To be glib, this looks like the kind of place I imagine lions would be. I won't go there. However, it can be really problematic when there's a glitch in our inner story, or we pretend it doesn't exist at all. So why is all of this important? I want to come back to issues societally of disclosure and sexual violence. To better understand how sexual violence sits in our society, we have to understand that it's still all about stories. Rape myths refer to inaccurate and yet widely believed ideas about rape. There are many lists and definitions. The one on the screen is an example for illustrative purposes. These are incredibly problematic. They not only prevent victims being believed when they disclose, but they can even affect the way a victim perceives their own assault. One of the most interesting here is that rape is perpetrated by a stranger or a dangerous individual in a dangerous place. The vast majority, and I'm talking huge, vast majority of them, are perpetrated by individuals known to the victim in an area that one would describe as safe and mundane. Dr. Jessica Taylor unpicks the prevalence of victim blaming in her book, Why Women Are Blamed for Everything, including this list of ways in which victims blame themselves. If you flick backwards and forwards between these and the list of myths on the previous slide, we can see they closely correlate. And these have a major impact on the victim's ability to process their own trauma, and also a likelihood that they will ever report it. With all of the above in mind, I would like in this final section to address some ways in which this thinking can impact our teaching of material involving sexual violence, and perhaps make better use of our educational spaces to address the issue of sexual violence, society's attitudes towards those against whom it is perpetrated, and the way in which maybe people like this think about themselves. I'm not going to speak about laying the groundwork for sensitive conversations and safe educational environments in this talk. I don't have time, although I'm happy to elaborate during the Q&A or if anyone contacts me. I would also like to be clear about what I am advocating for and what I'm not advocating for. I am not advocating that the classroom become a therapy space. That is not appropriate. Trauma processing is complex and needs to be done in a specialist environment. What I am advocating for is a space in which the narratives we create as educators challenge the damaging ones which might be suffered outside of our classrooms, challenge rape myths, and we use our language to create a space and to create an environment in which survivors feel seen, they feel able to be heard should they wish to be, and also they do not feel that we are reinforcing negative stereotypes around rape and sexual violence. The following are merely thoughts around how we avoid, if you will, compounding or perpetuating harm in the way we discuss these texts. When we discuss the issue of material containing sexual violence, usually we focus on access. We focus on enabling students to access and engage with material involving sexual violence safely and constructively. This is great. You know, essentially what we're saying here is we don't want survivors of sexual violence to have to not be in our classrooms. And that's brilliant as a starting point. I'm completely on board with this. But what if we could think about our language and the way we teach to try and work with our students to help them recognize abuse? Maybe provide younger students with language and vocabulary and structures for expressing experiences. And possibly take some steps towards helping them to overcome feelings of shame, guilt, or embarrassment, and reinforce the notion that your life does not end with your child abuse or your adult abuse. I have divided this passage from Sharon L. James into two to reflect my different feelings on the two sections. Section 1 reflects the power of classical myth as a story space. James comments on how valuable her students found the opportunity to consider sexual violence its place in society, and that's brilliant. Section 2, however, raises an issue for me. Why is it that the narrative the students are taking away is I am vulnerable? There's an opportunity here for more crucial messages. What if they've taken away, I'm aware of the harm rape causes and what constitutes sexual violence? I am more aware of the range of responses victims may have. I am less likely to commit acts of violence. We are aware generally that we are likely to have survivors in our classroom. However, given that an awful lot of abuse is peer-to-peer, no matter what age group you're teaching, at some point you will possibly teach a perpetrator. They are less likely to blame themselves should they be subject to violence, and hopefully they are more likely to disclose acts of violence. A trauma-informed approach acknowledges the legitimacy of an individual's trauma response. The language we use and the way we frame sexual violence is incredibly important. Reactions to trauma should be characterised as normal, justifiable, proportional, and rational. This is the list taken briefly from summarising some work by Jessica Taylor. So for an example, when discussing the rage of Artemis on being seen naked by Actaeon, what language do you use? Do you go straight for the overreaction narrative? Or do you discuss the vulnerability created in that moment for Artemis, and how vulnerability can so often lead to fear, which manifests as anger? If you're working with young children, might this be an opportunity to talk to them about who they might speak to if they felt scared or upset by something, anything? What messages are you sending when you describe Artemis as overreacting, as irrationally angry, when she has been seen naked and vulnerable? With this in mind, I have just a very few things. I have more things, but these are just a few for this talk to consider when speaking about violence. Think about the narrative that's inherent in your words. If there is no perpetrator, can there be correct assignment of blame? Seduction might feel easier or less traumatic to discuss, but what message does it send? It reinforces the idea that lines can be blurred. Students will encounter these myths again. You aren't preventing them from ever discovering there is a rape, but what you are doing is suggesting that rape is a matter of interpretation or the way you read the text. When you elide it, there's a particular textbook that came to my awareness which refers to the fall of the kings of Rome by referring to the behaviour of the king's son. Lucretia is not even mentioned. I understand this is to avoid a traumatic lesson or discussing something difficult, but as a rape survivor, what you hear is, you are not acceptable, I do not acknowledge you, and in a weird way, you are not welcome here. These are our myths. Let us have them, please. Victims are changed by violence, but avoid language which implies they are somehow reduced or no longer full people. And just don't excuse violence, please. This description by Amy Hines captures the issue perfectly. Persephone is a fascinating and complex figure whose kidnap is just one element of her character, but it is an important element. When we make this formative experience one of consensual seduction, we imply there is doubt in the original narrative, or that rape can be recast as an act of sex rather than an act of violence. Victims of rape will spend years in therapy learning that they were in fact assaulted, and they might spend a lifetime coping with people who don't believe it happened. We should avoid feeding the pernicious narrative that the definition of rape depends on one's interpretation. I now want to move into a couple of examples of how this might be done with reasonably young students. I'm aware that I've probably got different people from different backgrounds watching this, but I want to demonstrate that this can be done with the youngest of students to combat that reaction that I so often get when people say, well, what is, you can't discuss these things with insert age group here. Often teachers of all age groups comment that they are concerned about what is appropriate to discuss when it comes to myth and literature. My answer is always really simple about this. If you would say it in PSHE, you can say it in other contexts. If anything, marrying up your class content with the PSHE curriculum is crucially important because those messages need to be reinforced. They shouldn't be just something that's said in PSHE and everyone ignores the rest of the time. If that myth can be an excellent way to further explore matters which are raised in PSHE, or even introduce matters which you want to look at in a PSHE context. This slide is an example that's aimed at Key Stage 2, which would be primary school or children aged sort of between 7 and 10. Foundational activity, which is very well known by a lot of primary school teachers, involves greetings. You offer students a selection of greeting to choose from, for example, a wave, a hug, a high five, a handshake. You get them to think about what are they happy with doing with their peers and their classmates. And then they go around the room and they greet each other. And in their pairs, as they greet people, they have to express what they're comfortable with doing and listen to the person they're greeting as to what that person is comfortable doing, and find their compromise position where both people are comfortable with the chosen greeting. That is then the greeting they use. This is a really quick and easy way of explaining to children the importance of not only knowing your own boundaries, but knowing those of others. This can then be reinforced or worked with using the myth of Demeter and Persephone. So this image on the screen was done by our illustrator, Laura Jenkinson Brown, who's wonderful. And when she drew a comic strip to accompany a telling of Demeter and Persephone for the project I work with. And she has really clearly drawn Persephone with a no body language. This is to facilitate conversations with the children. What point in the story is this picture? What is Persephone clearly saying? How do you know? What should Hades do? What should Hades do next? What actually happens? How do we feel about this? How do we characterize the individuals? We can also look at listing all the individuals and their actions who do not respect the wishes and bodies of others in this story. Hint, there are quite a few of them. And also, when exploring the nature of power dynamics and how consent works, you can get them to think about, at a very basic level, Aphrodite. How do the children feel about her? Are they defending her? Can you challenge that? This slide looks at Key Stage 3, or Key Stage 4. We can begin to discuss the nuances of the myth as it relates to consent. The PSHE Association offers guidance on how to teach about consent, including suggested learning outcomes. There's a link to the area of their website at the bottom of my screen. The 3 statements on the screen are learning objectives, which are suggested by the PSHE Society for the teaching of consent at Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4. So let's just assume a more complex reading of the myth of Persephone, appropriate to Key Stage 3 or early Key Stage 4. Students might be asked if anyone in the telling you are using asks Persephone for her views directly on the situation. I imagine the answer will be no. Perhaps later, when she might be described as acquiescing to her confinement in the underworld for 6 months a year. Does anyone ask? If the answer is no, as it probably is, then a discussion may be had about why this is problematic. Can we say Persephone is consenting? Students might be asked to identify who has power in the myth, ranking them perhaps, how this is exercised. Where is Persephone in this list? Even if she agrees to her life in the underworld, if we look at this list of power dynamics, is this consent? How does power interact with the choices that we make? As a reader, what are our assumptions about Persephone and her consent? How does the myth lead us here? And how might we challenge this? I want to finish with a picture of some broken pottery. Persephone becomes a queen. Her assault, and we assume yearly re-traumatization, change her fundamentally. They do not leave her lacking in personhood. This is what trauma does. It changes you. It does not, however, leave you less of a person. You retain your status as a complete person, even if sometimes you may not feel like you have. The Japanese have an art form, kintsugi. Broken pottery, like the screen you're seeing, is mended with gold or silver lacquer, and the break becomes part of the item. The item is changed, but it is still whole. It is still a work of art. This is how I view sexual violence or any trauma. It creates change. That change cannot be undone. The pot can never be as it was, but survivors can find a way to live and even thrive. They are not diminished. Their trauma is a single element of the story. It is a single element of the beauty that is a person. When we speak about the women of myth, we should take them as a whole. They should not be reduced to victim or survivor, but neither should they be saved from their shame. Perhaps by giving them their voice in a reasonably complex way, we might open up space in our society for survivors to start to find theirs. Thank you very much for listening.